Good evening and welcome to tonight's program presented by the Rogers Center for Holocaust Education at Chapman University. This is the second event in our series, Fragments of Memory, New Lenses on the Holocaust. Tonight, thanks to the research of our presenter, art historian Monica Bohm Duchen, we will meet Charlotte Salomon, a Berlin-born German-Jewish artist whose exceptional talent was equaled only by her extraordinary determination to bring her artistic vision to life. Charlotte Salomon's life was cut short by the Holocaust, yet even as the threat of deportation hung over her head, Charlotte kept painting, ultimately completing a truly monumental series of gouache paintings entitled Life or Theater, considered by some to be the first graphic novel. We are fortunate tonight to have Ms. Bohm Duchen as our guide into the life and work of Charlotte Salomon. She is the author of numerous books, including Understanding Modern Art and second book, Art and the Second World War. She is the co-editor of Charlotte Salomon, Gender, Trauma, Creativity. She curated the major international exhibition entitled After Auschwitz, Responses to the Holocaust in Contemporary Art, which toured the UK. And she was the co-curator of the exhibit Life or Theater, the work of Charlotte Salomon, which was shown at the Royal Academy of Arts in London. Ms. Bohm Duchen has been a visiting lecturer at the Cortot Institute of Art in London and associate lecturer at Birkbeck College of the University of London. I should add that Monica is tonight demonstrating that attitude of carry on bravely, for which the British are rightly known. She has a bad cold, and I've assured her that we will certainly understand if she needs to take a brief pause to cough or to sip some tea. We're especially grateful to her for the effort she is making to be with us at what is 3 a.m. time in London. We will have a brief Q&A following Monica's talk. As questions occur to you during the presentation, please share them on the Zoom Q&A feature, not on chat. Jessica Milamuk, Associate Director of the Rogers Center, will moderate the post-presentation conversation. This event is being recorded and will be posted online within the next week or two. So thank you and welcome, Monica.
Her background, just a few brief words about how her life starts, what sort of milieu she comes from. She's born on the 16th of April, 1917, in the middle of the First World War, to a solidly bourgeois Berlin Jewish family. Her father, who's pictured here with his daughter perched on the chair next to her, was a well-known surgeon. We will come back to that. Her mother was a nurse during the war, and indeed that is how they met. I have to say that for purposes of time, I am having to simplify and, in a sense, reduce the complexity of both her own story, but also the story she tells in Life or Theatre, and that's just the way it is, but it's the point I need to make. Anyway, so suffice it to say, her beginnings are comfortable, they are seemingly relatively secure, although of course to be born in the midst of the war is hardly an auspicious beginning. But there she is then in two early photographs. And leaping forward to the way she is commemorated in situ, on the top left of your screen is the apartment block. It's still there in the predominantly Jewish, or pre-war predominantly Jewish suburb of Berlin called Charlottenburg. You can visit the building, you can see it for yourselves today. And what we have, if we are to visit there, are two commemorative plaques, one on the bottom left, as you can see. I'm not sure exactly when it was placed, but it was before the Stolperstein. I'm sure you all know about that extraordinary project. I won't go into that. On the right there, but commemorating the fact that she was born in this house, that she had to flee Germany in January 1939, deported to Auschwitz in 1943, via Drancy, as the Stolperstein reveals. So clearly our perception of this woman, this artist, cannot but be deeply and darkly overshadowed by the knowledge of her terrible fate. And yet, let me carry on. Let's concentrate now on Charlotte, or Charlotte Salomon, I should say, because the tendency is to call her Charlotte, which seems to me is a slightly demeaning way of referring to her. Tends to be the case with women artists. That's another conversation perhaps for later on. But let's concentrate on her as a creative individual, as an artist. Having said that, the work that she produces both before and while working on her great life's work, life or theatre, gives very little inkling, I think you will see what I mean by this, of the extraordinarily complex, impossible to categorize work that is life or theatre. So, for example, we have here a self-portrait done in Villefranche in the south of France, probably indeed at the time that she was embarking on, possibly even working on, life or theatre. I've put its location, it's in Yad Vashem, which actually does own quite a lot of her work, but not life or theatre, which belongs to the Amsterdam Jewish Historical Museum. I will come back to that later. But I've also put in brackets something quite significant for those of you in North America, that the portrait, discovered after the war, was gifted to Yad Vashem by a woman called Ottilie Moore, and Ottilie Gobel-Born is a descendant of Ottilie Moore, who plays a very, very major role in Charlotte's story. And again, I will come back to that. Well, looking at it, it's, I think it shows a woman who is indeed a complex human being, but it's not, dare I say it, that remarkable in itself. It introduces us to the main protagonist that we're discussing today. And yet, as I say, it gives very little inkling of the ambition of her big life's work. There are inklings of an unusual talent in the work that she does still in Berlin before she seeks refuge, joins her grandparents, as we'll see, in the south of France. And here is an extremely poignant work. It's tiny, intimate, doom-laden. Death and the Maiden, of course, a reference to the great Schubert. There are musical references aplenty in life or theatre, as we're about to discover. It does actually, it's referenced in life or theatre, which I won't have a chance to discuss, but I want to show it to you as an example of, yes, a sense of an unusual talent in the making, if you like, but again, nothing at all like the work that we're going to be concentrating on, for which she is rightly best known. So what is Leben oder Theater? What is life or theatre? As I've already suggested, it's impossible to categorize, virtually impossible. Every time I re-engage with it, I re-encounter, I'm astonished by its originality and its, it's a complete impossibility of pigeonholing it, and nor perhaps should we try to. She subtitled it A Play with Music, a Singspiel. The dates, we know that she worked on it for probably 18 months, possibly 2 years, in the depths of the Second World War, approximately between 1940 and 1942. In its totality, it is a work of about 1,300 small gouache images. Just imagine that number. They're tiny, they're about 10 inches by 13 inches, or I should say 13 inches by 10 inches in size, in gouache. She narrowed the 1,300 or so images and indeed accompanying text down to just under 800, which he then compiled into a, again, I'm not quite sure even what word to use, a portfolio, a sequence of works to which he gives this title. Notice, of course, the question marks. What is it? It's a kind of autobiography. To what extent it is fictive? To what extent literally and faithfully based on her own life experiences? Again, we will never know for sure, but it is clearly based on a real life. This is the cast list that comes very close to the beginning of the sequence. A three-colored play, a tricolored play with music, is an extraordinary fact, and you'll see what I mean very shortly, that she produces this extraordinary work with just 3 colors. Quite amazing. The primary colors. This was presumably to do with the scarcity of materials during the war, but what a technical challenge that she manages to surmount so magnificently. Again, for lack of time, I'm not going to go into detail, but just take a brief look at this so-called cast list, and you will see the main protagonists listed here. And I'll say straight away that each of them is indeed based on the main figures who play out in her own life, but given stage names, if you like. Yes, so she herself becomes Charlotte Kann. There is often a symbolic, quite loaded significance to the names she gives. Kann, ich kann, I can. This sort of sense of affirmative, sort of creativity is something that's, I think, not at all accidental. So there is indeed a significance to all the names that she chooses. As you can see, it spans a whole, well, several decades, starting in 1913, ending in 1940. Firstly in her native Germany, in Berlin, later in the south of France. This gives you a sense, and I'm actually hoping that this is going to be tantalizing, that you will be provoked by or prompted by my talk today to go to, in fact, at the very end, I'm going to give the details of a website belonging to the Amsterdam Museum, where you can indeed view all the work. And there are many books as well, which we can again discuss later if appropriate. So I'm just going to give you a tantalizing glimpse, a sample, if you like, of the work. So this is an image that comes early on in the work, which, as you can perhaps guess, actually alludes to her parents' marriage. I'm showing you the text that accompanies it, and I'll say more about this in a minute. There is music, there are cinematic references, there are literary references. This is not only or purely visual art. It is, I think, really in many ways a Gesamtkunstwerk with multiple references alluding to different art forms. So we twine for the Maiden's Wreath comes from Der Freischütz by Weber, the opera, and in retrospect, certainly, and in the context of the opera, takes on, I think, a suitably sinister or brooding, premonitory kind of aspect. So the music often reinforces the mood of the images, sometimes actually contradicts them, works in a kind of creative tension to them. But here they are in the middle of the war, marrying. I put this one in. First of all, well, you can see accompanied by a very different tune, a Christmas carol in effect. Also a reminder, of course, and notice the rather large Christmas tree sort of in the middle, right of the composition, that we are talking here about a very, very assimilated Berlin Jewish family, German Jewish family. Now, I don't think I have to say more about this for an audience like this, but suffice it to say that to celebrate Christmas in that milieu was no apparent contradiction to a sense of actually still being quite aware, if not necessarily very religiously observant, of your Jewishness. So yes, a childhood that encapsulates and embraces celebrating Christmas, but also, as you can see, creating snowmen and playing in the snow, playing with hula hoops, and so on and so forth. In other words, apparently, and indeed, actually, it would seem, a fairly happy and typical German Jewish childhood. And then tragedy strikes. When Charlotte is only 9 years old, her mother commits suicide. And there's a whole heartbreaking sequence of gouache images which relate to this appalling episode. And this, to my mind, is one of the most poignant of the lot, where in a very remarkably inventive kind of image, Franziska, her mother, apparently promises, yes, the young girl that she will write to her from up above, from heaven, to keep in touch, to tell her what it's like. And of course that, for obvious reasons, never happens. Now, I want to flick forward to this because, as perhaps you can immediately see from the visual shape, if that's the word, the formation of these words, this is the tracing paper, this is the text that is overlaid, let me go back to this, over the image, deliberately and very consciously, self-consciously, echoing, yes, mirroring the forms of the visual images. Let me go back to that. So here you see, and it's very difficult to evoke unless you see the work itself with the overlays on it. I mean, this was intended to be read as a book, let's not forget that, whereby you could actually both see the tracing paper words overlaying an image like this, but also, of course, then lift the tracing paper to view the image alone. But it gives you an important sense of what is characteristic of most of the works that feature in certainly the first part of this massive work, this extraordinarily original and inventive way of combining text and image. This is the stark, brutal, in a sense, image which recreates the moment of Franziska's death. I should say that she had tried several times earlier to take her own life by various means, and eventually she does it by throwing herself out of the apartment window on the 3rd floor. Notice the reiteration of the tune that was alluded to in the wedding scene. Notice that almost, well, again, brutally detached commentary. And this is also very typical of Charlotte Salomon's ability to both be part of the action, but also to detach herself from it. There is nothing more to be done about the tragedy, that terse, heartbreaking sort of commentary. Look also how differently wrought, crafted the work is. It's much more rough and raw than, for example, if I just even compared with this to the earlier works. And there are certain works that have no text at all, and I think you will agree do not need text. And if there was ever, a sort of heartbreaking is really the only word that seems appropriate, sort of distillation of a young girl's despair. This surely has to be it in the wake of her mother's death. And yet, children are resilient, life moves on. And when Charlotte is 13, a burgeoning sort of adolescent, very much the age indeed of Anne Frank as she begins to write her diaries, but let's keep that aside for the moment, somebody else enters her life. An extraordinarily charismatic, indeed beautiful woman, a professional contralto singer called Paula Lindberg, who we know from the historical record was a very successful singer. She enters Charlotte's life because she starts a relationship with her surgeon father, and indeed, in due course, they marry. And here is a vibrant, I think you would agree, life-affirming tribute to her stepmother, to the new woman in her life, if you like, which introduces, again, not unexpectedly now, I think, a kind of complex rendition of that relationship. It was tinged with jealousy that, in fact, her father's had precedence perhaps in Paula's life. Of course he did as her husband. The complexity of a young girl and this charismatic woman, there's even a tinge of a kind of, oh gosh, dare I say it, homoerotic fascination with her. I don't want to make too much of that, but it's there in the work. I think I could say that quite confidently. And much of the ensuing image, many of the ensuing images are indeed about this, again, complicated, but essentially life-affirming relationship with Paula. And, well, this is interesting, isn't it? Paula actually came from an observant Jewish family, much more observant than Charlotte's blood family. Her father indeed was a rabbi. But look at this, the kind of tongue-in-cheek, again, the kind of irony, not exactly sarcasm, but a kind of profound irony and indeed humor that actually often enters the work, which is often overlooked when people tend to be slightly pious in their view of Charlotte as a Holocaust victim. And that's something else that I think is important to bear in mind. So yes, here she is singing in Christian churches sometimes for non-Jewish audiences. People were full of admiration. There was still so much true piety to be found among Christian youth, knowing full well, indeed, that Paula was not Christian at all. And then outside events intervene with a vengeance. What is interesting, let me just take a little sip of water, is that the number of images that allude directly to Nazism and the Third Reich are relatively few. There are literally just a handful. The way those terrible events impact on her family, that's another matter. But of course, they're deeply significant, and this is the first of them. Look for yourselves at the text that accompanies this devastating image, marking, of course, the coming of the Nazis to power, the election of Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany, the beginning of the end, one might say, certainly in retrospect. But look at that text. I'm not going to read it to conserve my voice, but it's full of a kind of deep ambiguity, isn't it, about the Jews, about being Jewish, which again, I think is fascinating. It's symptomatic of indeed the ambiguity, I think, felt by many German Jews about their Jewishness, both in the interwar period, but also I think even during the Third Reich. And again, well, it adds a level of complexity and a problematic aspect that cannot, I think, be ignored. Does Charlotte really believe this? We don't know, but the fact that she actually introduces these deeply, sort of difficult and problematic notions is obviously important. I put this on because you may already, the observant ones among you, may have noticed something rather curious. I've chosen the photograph on the right almost at random, but to make the point that, as you can see by this juxtaposition, she's reversed swastika. Now, again, we cannot be sure why she did this. Mary Feldstein, who I must acknowledge is the very first academic to write a book on Charlotte Salomon, and to whom we owe a great deal, has posited the idea, and I'm inclined to go along with her, that actually somehow it was a small gesture of defiance against the Nazis, that she could, in a sense, subvert the power of this toxic symbol by, in her artwork, reversing it visually. We can't be sure, but certainly it's a significant gesture. And then there do indeed follow a sequence of works which relate to the ever darkening atmosphere and the external events that take place, in the wake of Hitler's accession to power. Here, perhaps more straightforwardly, kind of parroting, that's not quite the right word, but, sort of replicating the rhetoric that, as I'm sure you know, accompanied the early days of the Third Reich, and only, of course, got much, much worse. And then she turns to the way in which it impacts directly on her family. And here's a very, very powerful image that reveals how her very successful and utterly dedicated doctor father, a well-known surgeon, is ousted from his job. Before I go on, I think, again, for those of you perhaps with some art historical knowledge, may have picked up or perhaps with my help, can pick up the reference in the top half of the image, so brutally crossed out, quite literally crossed out, to Rembrandt's famous painting of the Dr. Tulp, the surgeon at work. And I think one thing I haven't mentioned yet, which is very evident in much of the work, is her deep knowledge of Western art history, the way that in some cases, as here, she alludes directly and indeed draws on great works of art of the past. So that's also a very important point. But she does it here, of course, to reinforce the despair depicted in the bottom half of the composition, with which Dr. Salomon, Dr. Kahn, Professor Kahn, in Leben oder Theater, reacts to his dismissal. He's forced to work in the Jewish hospital, the only opening left to him. So too, her stepmother, look at it, it speaks for itself with the text reinforcing the images in full flight, as it were. She's shown as being heckled, yes, by Nazi members of the audience, again, the beginning of the end. And I should mention, not merely in passing, but it's actually quite important that although Charlotte herself is quite critical, particularly in this later stage of her depiction of her stepmother, of her attitudes, that actually we know that she became very active in the Jüdische Kulturbund, the Jewish Culture League, yes, which, as some of you may know, became very active when so many talented individuals in Germany were ousted from their positions in mainstream German life. And she also did a great deal to help, sort of give practical help to people in trouble. So she is actually a very remarkable woman, there's no question about that. As for Charlotte herself, she's now a teenager, she's on the brink of young adulthood. She has very determined artistic ambitions. And after taking private lessons, her parents are not hugely encouraging. They think she probably ought to be a fashion designer because it would be more practical in financial terms for her future. But she's absolutely determined to get into the Academy of Fine Arts in Berlin. And there are a number of images which allude to this. And here is one which shows that actually she didn't get in initially. And look how, in a sense, dark and downward dragging it is in its evocation of her failure to pass the entrance exam. Notice also the very dominant presence on the right of the composition of the brown shirts, fellow students, a reminder of the times. And then, this isn't immediately after, but it comes obviously after the other one in terms of time sequence, she gets in. She gets in. And look how different, just in purely visual terms, how effective it is that this is all darkness and gloom in a sense. And here, strongly colored, triumphant, she's made it. She's made it. Notice how we now only have one brown shirt, not two, less prominent, I think you might say, in the top right-hand corner. Notice also the tune that accompanies it, not a German tune at all this time, but from the Marseillaise. Okay, we'll come back to the significance of that later in terms of her life story. So yes, she trains as an artist against all the odds. At least for a while, she's able to be one of very, very few Jewish students at the Academy of Fine Arts, even during the Third Reich. And one reason is that her father had excelled himself, won an Iron Cross, in fact, as so many German Jews had in the First World War. Also, ironically, she was deemed to be so kind of mousy and physically unattractive and that we have documentation to prove this, that she was deemed not to be a risk to pure German manhood as a woman among many male students. And then we move on to the main section. As you may have noted in the cast list, there are three parts to this work: the prelude, the main section, and the epilogue. Now, the main section is by far the largest in terms of numbers. Again, for lack of time, though, I need to keep it fairly brief. Much of it disproportionate number of works in the main section are dedicated one way or another to this gentleman, somebody who in real life was called Alfred Wolfson, who actually ended up in England. He came over to England. He managed to escape in time. And I actually had the pleasure and the privilege of meeting a woman who was already quite elderly, who had actually been a student of his, a singing student of his here in England, a remarkable sense of, you know, the living thread of history. In Life or Theatre, he's called Amadeus d'Abalone, again, a slightly ironical name, obviously a reference partly to the great Mozart, entering to the tune of the Toreador's song from Carmen, both the celebration of this man who was to play a great part in her life, but also, I think, slightly subverting and commenting slightly ironically on him simultaneously. She doesn't take him entirely at face value, but he is crucial to her. He comes initially seeking a permit from Paula to work as a singing teacher after, indeed, once again, having been ousted from mainstream German society. He engages in a flirtatious, here you are, he begins, I think what can really only be called a very flirtatious relationship with Paula, and simultaneously a very, very intimate and complicated relationship with the young Charlotte. And what ensues, and I must keep an eye on the time, is an extraordinary sequence of literally dozens of works which become increasingly kind of almost cartoon-like, even caricature-like in style, where she reveals the intimacy of their relationship. He was, again, an extraordinary character who encourages her as an artist. Indeed, it's he who is the recipient initially of the Death in the Maiden image that I showed you at the beginning. He has these complex, not I think hugely original, but complex ideas about the very nature of creativity being born from profound suffering, which he imparts to Charlotte, which are going to prove extremely, I mean, hugely important for the creation of Life or Theatre. But let me give you an idea of what I mean. I mean, look at these. They're really quite weird, strange, extraordinary, as I say, almost caricatural. You also have to remember that she is depicting what he says in huge amount of detail entirely from memory as she creates this work later on. And there are literally pages of these where he says in a nutshell how crucial it is to have suffered deeply in order to be truly creative. A very Nietzschean idea. And then there's a series of very, very frank, sexually frank images where, and again, we will never know whether this is true or not. Paula, in the post-war period, vowed that they'd never had a sexual relationship, but we don't know. It certainly seems from the record here that yes, Charlotte and Abalone did become sexual partners. There are also some incredibly poignant, again, wordless images of the way that, thanks to anti-Jewish laws, of course, they were forced to meet in places like train station cafes or on empty park benches late at night. And then there's Kristallnacht. Again, one of the relatively few images which allude directly, which refer directly to external events. And in the wake of that terrible event, and of course, we're coming up to the anniversary of it, let me just show you another image relating to Kristallnacht. And another. And actually, before moving on, I have to tell you that, as again you may know, many German Jewish men were arrested and deported to concentration camps in the wake of Kristallnacht, and one of them was her father, this cultivated, skilled surgeon forced to do manual labor. And again, look at the dark, dark irony of the text that accompanies this, the camp guard brutally saying, "You need to work, there'll be no loafing here." Stark, dramatic, terrible. Paula intervenes. I must speed up a little bit. I'm noticing that time is rolling on all too fast, and he is actually released. And again, I think a devastatingly simple and direct image where the husband and wife are embracing on his return as a broken man, not surprisingly, with Charlotte looking stiffly on as an isolated figure, quite separate. And like so many other families, there are discussions among the family and their friends. What next? What do we do? And notice once more the kind of ambivalence of the text that accompanies this image, vivid evocation of the kind of claustrophobic tension, perhaps, of the time. Again, just a reminder of how tracing paper is still being employed here, once again, very vividly echoing and reinforcing the visual composition. And here she is preparing to leave Germany forever, going to the south of France to join her maternal grandparents, who had already gone in 1933, at the invitation of Ottilie Moore, the American woman I mentioned early on, to the very beautiful Côte d'Azur village of Villefranche, just a few miles from Nice on the Mediterranean coast. Packing a minimum of things, notice the old-fashioned tennis racket. She has to give the appearance of just going for a holiday, a short holiday. And so she goes. Here's another dark and terribly poignant image of the final moment of departure from Berlin. And here's briefly a photograph of those parents, Marianne and Ludwig Grunwald, in real life. And then we have the epilogue. It starts life-affirmingly, again, bright, hot colors, an evocation of, indeed, the very real beauty of that part of the world. And then again, world events impact with a vengeance. One gets the outbreak of war, referred to here as the grandmother, hunched in an almost fetus-like position, is listening to the news. War is declared. The German troops have crossed the Rhine. And her grandmother, always prone to bouts of depression, soon tries to take her own life. And one has again, and notice once more, the change in style. This is now going to become the hallmark of this latter part of the work, reductive, urgent, raw in every sense, with reference, of course, to Beethoven here, the Ode to Joy. Charlotte is trying desperately to persuade her grandmother to want to live. And in the wake of her grandmother's attempted suicide comes another extraordinary moment where her grandfather reveals to Charlotte for the very first time that her mother had indeed committed suicide. What I haven't mentioned yet, quite on purpose, is that when it actually happened, she was told that her mother had died of influenza. She was not told the truth. Yes, and that indeed many other female members of her family had taken their own lives, including her aunt, her namesake Charlotte, way back in 1913, which indeed is alluded to in Life or Theatre. Well, there you are, it's mentioned here. Just imagine the impact of that. And just to complicate things further, this is an image that's not part of Life or Theatre, but which we think was done by Charlotte on her grandfather's deathbed in 1943. And I'm jumping forward here, but I have to inject yet another hugely complicating element into this extraordinary story. We have evidence that in 1943, Charlotte actually poisoned her own grandfather with veronal. Now, we cannot be sure, and this is something perhaps we can discuss in the Q&A shortly, but I feel it incumbent on me to introduce this deeply problematic possibility. I'll come back to the grandfather. And well, hardly surprisingly, in the wake of these revelations, you get images like this. Don't let me go mad. Don't let me go mad. What can I do? What can I do? Because indeed, the grandmother does actually, in the end, kill herself. Then there's May 1940, the invasion, occupation of France by the Germans. The second time, in a sense, war is declared. By this time, her grandmother indeed is no more. And one of the things that happens in the wake of the occupation of France, and this is a complicated story historically, let me keep it simple, both Charlotte and her grandfather are deported to the concentration camp of Gouache in the French Pyrenees. Now, this is not actually depicted, interestingly enough, directly in the work at all. There are only a handful of pages which allude to the experience of it, which is interesting, I think, in itself. They do manage to get out. They come back to Nice. They live together, the grandfather and the granddaughter. Deeply problematic relationship. There is strong evidence that, and again, I hesitate to say this, but I have to say it, that indeed, and there are allusions in the work itself, that Charlotte, that her grandfather actually made unwanted, well, of course, unwanted sexual advances to her, and that indeed he may have sexually abused his daughters, okay, which may indeed have been the last straw, very much the last straw, and may give some validation to the possibility that she indeed did kill him. And so it went. She, after her grandfather's death, she secretes herself away. She hides away on Cap Ferrat near Villefranche, and she works intensively on Leben oder Theater, what becomes Leben oder Theater. And keeping it very brief, the last few pages of this work, images are dispensed with. There are these desperately, hastily painted words which go on for pages and pages, which essentially are her saying, I am not going to kill myself. I will resist that death wish. That's from within my own family. I will defy the events closing in on me. And it ends with this body of text, which I will briefly read out to you. Yes, with dream awakened eyes, she saw all the beauty around her, saw the sea, felt the sun, and knew she had to vanish for a while from the human plane and make every sacrifice in order to create her world anew out of the depths. And then the final image of this work, and from that came Leben oder Theater, literally inscribed on her body. Wow, as you can see, I can't fail to be moved every time I talk about her. Let me tell you very, very briefly what happens next. She completes the work. She bundles it into a brown paper parcel. And I think realizing it perhaps wasn't that hard to realize that the clouds were gathering rapidly, she donates, hands over the work with the words property of Ottilie Moore, the American woman who by now has actually returned to America, incidentally taking a number of orphan children with her. She was actually a remarkable woman in her own right. She hands it to the local doctor, who was also not accidentally a member of the French resistance, saying very, sort of meaningfully, she says, take this, c'est toute ma vie, it's all my life in every possible sense. In the meantime, she had struck up a romantic relationship with a fellow refugee called Alexander Nagler, and they had made the terrible mistake of going to the registry office locally to register to get married. And they were on record as being Jewish, and that ultimately was their downfall. And in September 1943, they were both arrested by the Gestapo, by then the south of France, hitherto occupied by the Italians. With the changing of sides of Italy to the Allied side, the Germans move in, and that truly is the beginning of the end for Charlotte and her husband, as he then was. They get taken to the Gestapo headquarters in Nice, the Hotel Excelsior, thence to Drancy, as you saw alluded to in that Stolperstein at the very, very beginning, and thence to Auschwitz. And we know that she was murdered on arrival, probably on the 10th of October 1943. She was 26 and 5 months pregnant. You can't make it up, can you? You simply can't. But the work lived on, because against all the odds, the work survived. And after the war, Ottilie Moore comes back to the south of France to try and discover what had happened to the people she'd left behind. She's reunited with Dr. Moridis, the doctor I mentioned, who hands her this brown paper parcel, just imagine. And then a year later, I think it was 1947, Charlotte's father and stepmother, having survived the war mainly in hiding in Holland, come to the south of France again to try and find out what had happened to Charlotte. And just imagine their emotions when presented with this body of work of which they had absolutely no knowledge whatsoever. They weren't sure what to do with it. And for a while they hug it to their chest. As I mentioned at the beginning, it was only in the early 60s that the first book was published on her work and the first exhibition. There have been many, many exhibitions and indeed books since. And I'd like to just end with this film poster, because I know that in just 2 days' time, you're going to have the opportunity to see the latest artistic response to Charlotte and her life's work. And I'll be very, very interested to know, I don't think I'll be able to join you because I think it's only a live event, what you make of it. But I hope at the very least that what I have imparted to you today will enable you to gauge for yourselves, to kind of think critically about the way in which Charlotte and Leben oder Theater is depicted in this latest animated film. Thank you very much indeed. I'm just going to end perhaps just with one last slide here. I could actually send Marilyn and Jessica the link. This is where you need to go if you want to actually access the entire body of work for yourselves online, courtesy of the Amsterdam Museum. Thank you very much. I think I've just about got a bit of voice left, so if anybody has any questions or comments, I'll be very happy to take them. Let me stop sharing.
All right, well, thank you so much. I wish we had more time and you had more voice so that we could listen to you even longer. That was quite a fascinating presentation. I do have a number of questions. We're not going to get to them all, I can tell you that right now. But what I'll do is kind of put them in within topics. So I do have a number that are about the book in general. So one person was asking, you'd mentioned the overlay, the page that had the overlays. Are there overlays for each painting, or is it just?
Not all of them. I can't remember the exact point at which it ends, but the epilogue, you know, as events catch up with her, as things get more and more urgent, then overlays get dispensed to. It may be also that she ran out of tracing paper. Let's not forget the very practical issues here. So it's certainly, it's in the, yeah, it's mostly in the prelude in the first half, not even a third, it's less, the first section and parts of the main section as well. Yeah.
And then another person had asked, how does music feature in the book? Are there lyrics only? Is it kind of common knowledge?
A very good question. And also when I use the word book, I mean, it was conceived of as a book that you would leaf through, but she never actually bound it. They were kind of, in a sense, when she wrapped it up, they were loose leaf images, which have only ever been displayed as such, obviously in sequence. So, you know, one needs to bear that in mind. Yes, music. No, it's laden with musical references. And I think what she's presupposing is an audience well enough versed in music of all kinds, from, you know, Schubert and Beethoven to popular songs of the day. So there's a very wide repertoire of songs, but which enabled her to draw perhaps on that supposition of knowledge, you know, to kind of to reinforce and render even more complex her work. So they're not even, well, they're fragments of lyrics or sometimes to the tune of, yeah, so it's allusions rather than actual incorporation.
I also have a couple of questions about the 1300, the 1300 pieces. One person was asking, are they correct in their understanding that all of those pieces were painted with 3 colors?
Yes.
And then another person, I'm sorry, I'll let you answer that one, then I'll go back to it. Go ahead.
No, yes, absolutely.
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
it's hard to believe, but it's true.
That's amazing. And then another person said, if there are about 800 pieces in the book, where are the other pieces?
Yeah, no, very, very good question. I told you it's all complicated. It really is. But basically, the total body of work numbers about 1,300 pieces. And she herself edited and reworked the work, I think, many times over. But the final decision, as it's come down to us, is that I think it's 768, don't quote me on that, but something like that, numbered works. And there are even some inconsistencies in that numbering, some repetition. The other works still exist. And indeed, they can be seen in the Amsterdam Jewish Historical Museum, but they are, I think, by her own admission, to be seen as separate, as extra, if you like. Yeah.
I had a question about that somebody asked about the backward swastika. So I'm just going to go ahead and read it because it's a little bit longer.
No, go ahead. Sure.
So it's on the backward swastika on the red flag, and Charlotte's text indicating how many Jewish lives were affected by that symbol. Could she be referring to the Hinduist swastika, a symbol of life and good luck, which when facing left refers to the dark and destructive side of Kali? And for those of you who don't know Kali, I'm going to let you guys look that up instead of reading more. So could Charlotte herself perhaps have destroyed the life of her grandfather to free others from violence in the same vein as Kali?
That's a really interesting comment. What can one say? Nothing is definite, nothing is sure, but yes, I think that's a very interesting suggestion. Thank you.
I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on whether or not there's any artistic or any other kind of significance to the fact that so many of the faces, particularly of the artist herself, were more brown in color.
Not really. I'm just wondering if that's actually true across the board. I'm not sure. Again, as I say, you've only seen a very tiny portion of the work. I wouldn't say that's necessarily the case. I mean, no, I don't think I can really comment usefully on that.
Okay. Where can folks view Charlotte's artwork? Is it on display in a museum? I know you said that it was online.
Yes. Now, what the Jewish Historical Museum has done, and it's a wonderful resource, is to provide this complete, sort of run of the work online. If one goes to the museum, I don't know how many of you will have a chance to or indeed have been. I think I'm right in saying that there's usually a small sample of the work on display. Very memorably in 2017, the centenary of her birth, they did an extraordinary exhibition of the entire work. It was the very, very first time ever, and probably, a very rare opportunity to see the work in its entirety. And I went specially. It took me 2 intensive visits to do it any sort of justice. It is a difficult, challenging work to display, but the interest continues, and it's not just exhibitions. Perhaps just to accentuate what I said by way of conclusion, that I think not unsurprisingly, the work and indeed her whole life story has prompted a whole welter, if that's the word, a range of artistic responses from novels and poetry, from films, plays, operas. It is actually quite extraordinary. So that this latest animated film is just one in a line of such responses.
I have an interesting question. I'm gonna. Depending on the length of the answer, it may be the last one.
Go ahead, and Jessica, I'm very happy to carry on a bit because I actually didn't mean to go on quite as long. So if people have the patience and inclination to carry on, I'm happy to.
That's very nice of you, because I know your throat. I don't want to have you talk longer than you need to. But I did have an interesting question. Someone has asked, how common was it to create this sort of work with verbal overlays on top of paintings? Are there other such works of this genre from this time period?
Absolutely not, I think, is the simple answer. I mean, I think this is the point, and I don't want to kind of keep laboring the point, but it is a unique artwork. There is really no counterpart that I'm aware of to it, and people have tried. We all try to pigeonhole things, don't we, where we can, and it's often been cited as the first graphic novel. Yes, it has been influential on graphic novelists since then, in the present as well. But actually that term also doesn't really do it justice. It's much more than that. So, you know, in so many ways, it is actually quite special.
And then I have one longer question, one very short, easy answer, I think, for you. So one of our guests wrote Charlotte Salomon's commitment to a work of such complexity over such a short amount of time of creation suggests that she had a sense of urgency to get her story expressed.
Absolutely.
But she didn't know she would die, or did she think she might? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's again a very, very good question. I mean, you know, she had a pretty good sense of what was going on, at least in her immediate environment. Yes. What she didn't know, and I think this is important and goes back to what I was saying at the very beginning, the Holocaust as we now designate it, clearly she had absolutely no idea of what that might mean, what it was to be, in a sense. Yes, she could only know what she knew, and that was not the wider picture. And yet, yes, there was undoubtedly the sense of urgency, and I think those final pages of text bear that out. She's dispensing with images, she's writing ever more tightly packed, you know, sort of urgent sort of calligraphy. And also, as well as that, I mean, it's not only external world events or events specifically happening in the south of France, but also this sort of sense of needing to defy the death wish in herself. Yes, that actually enters the mix. Yeah, absolutely.
And then I don't know if you'd mentioned it, but somebody just was wondering, where did Charlotte Salomon study art? What school?
Yes, I did mention it briefly. It was in the Academy of Fine Arts in Berlin.
Berlin.
So actually, you know, very prestigious institution. Yeah, she had to stop. I didn't have time to mention it. She actually, as things got harder and harder for Jews in Berlin, she was actually ousted, but she did, you know, at least have a certain amount of formal training and access to the library, etc.
So our final question, and this is speculation, but do you have any idea as to how she might have intended to present her work to the public? Would it have been maybe a performance with music, some sort of exhibition? Do you have any idea how she might have envisioned that?
Again, that's a good question, and you know, an important one to sort of think about. I think, given the way that, you know, its physical nature, that probably it was, at the risk of repeating myself, you know, sort of envisaged as a book, as a volume to leaf through, whereby you could indeed dwell on each image and text, you could lift the overlays, you could think about the musical references. So as a kind of a sequence of complex images and text. There are cinematic references as well, which I haven't even talked about, but you know, so I think that would be my first answer. But of course, the very fact that it has been exhibited in different ways, it's prompted these other artistic responses in other art forms, suggests that there are multiple ways of presenting the work, or of you know, of engaging with it.
Absolutely. Well, I just wanted to thank you so much for taking the time and so early in the morning for you when you're not feeling well. So we do all appreciate that. This was a fascinating introduction to Charlotte Salomon and her work. So thank you again.